January and February meetings are both held on Zoom. A few years ago, we made this transition in the most miserable months of the year when nobody probably wants to come out. I'll be honest, I came right from work today. I didn't really want to come out with this cold, dark weather, right? So we'll be hosting the January and February meetings on Zoom. Be sure that you're on our email list. If you're unsure about that, you can either see Bob or Don. January 27th, we will have historian Thomas Horrocks talking about promoting Honest Abe, the rail splitter. And then February's will be the Confederacy's most modern general, James Longstreet in the Civil War, by Colonel Harold Knudsen, retired colonel in the U.S. Army. So definitely reach out to either Bob or Don to make sure you're on the mailing list for those Zoom links. Finally, before we get to the presentation tonight, one final announcement, and that is that our longtime member, board member, Bob Lytle, is journeying to a new home. Bob and his wife Carolyn are both going to be moving to Maryland to be closer to their family and their friends. What is a tremendous loss for our organization will be a tremendous gain for those folks down in Maryland. But I do just want to say a word of thank you to Bob for everything that he has done. That includes from being basically a founding member. One of the first meetings, right, Bob, I think that you attended, to being our speaker organizer for years, to the flag bearers every month that you get in the mail. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The holiday dinners, everything else, Memorial Day services that Bob has been involved in. He's been a crucial part of our organization. We'll certainly miss him. But thank you, Bob, for everything that you've done for our organization. Okay, so tonight we are joined by a different Bob, Bob Foster. Oh well, we'll let that go. So allow me to introduce tonight's speaker, Robert Foster. Robert Foster has been a vice president of the Lincoln Group of Boston for the past 7 years and a regular member for 25 years. This club is made up of professors and authors who have or are teaching at Harvard, Brown, Roger Williams, Bridgewater, Stonehill, and other universities and colleges. When their board of directors read Mr. Foster's book, Blue is Not Just a Word, The Civil War Within, which he has a few copies of with him this evening, they asked if he would be their vice president, which is an honor that blew and still blows his mind because, as he claims, quote, I am in no way, shape, or form an academic. It's been the ultimate honor, though, end quote. He's also a lifetime member of the Lincoln Forum of Gettysburg, which is a larger national version of the Lincoln Group of Boston, which has some of today's leading historians as speakers. Lastly, for 30 years, Mr. Foster was the vice president of the General Lander Post-5 Civil War Roundtable on the North Shore, a post which he stepped down from this last year. With that, I'd like to welcome Bob to present tonight's topic about the true meaning of the Confederate flag then and now. Mr. Foster.
As I looked at the January speaker that you're going to have, Tom Horrocks, he's written about 10 Lincoln books. He's taught at Brown and Harvard, and just coincidentally, he wrote the first blurb on the first page of my book, so I'm rubbing elbows with some pretty great historians. I'd like to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving next week, and thank Mark and Don and Joe for doing this, and I really appreciate it. And I consider every speech I give to be a success when I remember to bring my reading glasses, because I've never forgotten them before in 30 years of doing this, except for 3 or 4 times. But anyway, okay, I'd like to thank you all very much. It really is an honor to come speak to you tonight, but I must warn you that organizations that invite me to speak sometimes find they've gotten more than they've bargained for. For example, my favorite ex-Confederate soldier became a fairly successful author after the war, and it was on a book tour in the Dominican Republic when he was informed that just down the road was a museum that contained the actual skull of Christopher Columbus. So he went to that museum, paid the price of admission, and this was when Mark Twain got more than he bargained for. Because when he went there were two skulls there. One of Christopher Columbus when he was an adult, next to a smaller one of Christopher Columbus when he was a baby. The other thing I really need you to know, for this speech to have the effect I hope it does, is that I would like you to understand that if I was born in the North, I would have fought for the North. And if I was born in the South, I would have fought for the South. I'm not here to praise or condemn anyone, but to let historical fact clarify truth and nothing more. This talk is 50 minutes long. It's called The True Meaning of the Confederate Flag, Then and Now. If you like it, I'd like to come back to give part 2, which is a 45-minute talk called Critical Race Theory, Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War. It's the final and necessary thing I need to say after I've been speaking to roundtables, colleges, historical societies, high schools, libraries, and elsewhere for the past 25 years, as I'm retiring from speaking. From here on out, I just want to be in the audience. Please, let your program director know if you'd like me to come back. Let me have a sip of water and we'll get to work. Days before he died in 1978, the late great Pulitzer Prize winning author Bruce Catton said his one regret in writing about the American Civil War was too many Americans would not be willing to face the truth of what caused the war for perhaps another 100 years. He meant white Americans, and their avoidance of truth would cause a whole lot of unnecessary turmoil and heartache for the nation. Well, my life is 85% over, and I won't be here in 2078, so I'm not waiting. In too many places, there's an attempt to push that date further into oblivion by ignoring historical facts the real Yankees and rebels would agree on if they were among us. Tonight they are with us because they're always with me. Lincoln said the only way he could be misunderstood was by being misrepresented. Well, that also goes for the American Civil War. For what good can all the bloodshed do, blue and gray, if we're not honest about what caused the war? No American should be wrong about that, because then we can be wrong about anything and easily believe the lies of history's latest wannabe dictators. Now, usually I speak on the politics of 1776 through the American Civil War because you cannot understand the war without understanding the politics that allowed it to happen. A few times, to lighten the atmosphere, I've spoken on the humor of Abraham Lincoln and that of soldiers blue and gray. However, to my everlasting regret, and because of the necessity of it, I'm always drawn back to the most unpleasant subject in human history: slavery. The politics of American slavery are the politics of the American Civil War. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be doing something like this. When I came to my first Civil War roundtable meeting 30 years ago, if slavery came up at all in those early years, it was only in passing, like an unwanted blemish on the prom night of an adolescent nation. If it wasn't acknowledged, no one had to be held responsible, even though Abraham Lincoln said, "We all are." Ignoring slavery just didn't feel right in my imperfect, beloved city of Lynn, Massachusetts, where Frederick Douglass once called home. At best, slavery was reluctantly admitted to being a minor cause of the war, with other causes, although never clearly defined, far more important. This disturbed me to the depths of my being, because not only did I know this was wrong and dangerous, but unhealthy for the future of American democracy. I knew this because I had a great public school American history teacher for a mother, and because my 7th grade history teacher, Sister Marietta, told us so. Sister Marietta taught us that the South wanting to bring, her quote, the sin, end quote, of slavery into the territories, and the North wanting to restrict it as a first step to sending it to, quote, its ultimate extinction, as Lincoln said, was the why the war came. Every book my mom suggested and dozens I found and read on my own confirm this simple, sad, indisputable truth. But at round tables, I just didn't know what the hell to do about it. Now I love and still love the fascinating talks on battles and fun things like guessing the color of the tips of little sorrel's ears. That's Stonewall Jackson's horse, by the way, and the answer is dark brown. But while always remembering the cautioning words of my mother that one slave was too many, every time I heard an influential minority of Civil War roundtable leaders say that slavery didn't cause the war, a twisted, perverted version of the Twilight Zone's music would haunt me for days. I lost sleep and felt more weariness for the well-being of our nation than I can say. For hadn't Thomas Jefferson won the Second Continental Congress in 1776 that if they removed the clause he wrote from the Declaration of Independence to end slavery, a huge bloodbath over slavery would occur in the not-too-distant future? When they voted to remove the clause, he told his fellow slave owners that if there is a just God ruling the universe, they were going to pay and pay dearly for not ending, quote, this curse. Once that bloodbath began in 1861, Northerners like Abraham Lincoln and William Seward, and Southerners like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens said many times that Jefferson was right when he said, quote, slavery is the rock upon which the Union will split, end quote. So why is there still confusion about it today? And why isn't the cause of the war out front and center? Not to be talked about at every meeting, of course, but to simply get it right once and for all, so everyone from history professors to innocent children of every color can feel sincerity when they come to a Civil War roundtable, wherever it is. Just as Lincoln said, quote, even God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time, end quote, there is no way to defend the Confederacy and be sincere. However, working hard to understand the Confederacy is the essence of sincerity. Sincerity and honesty are indispensable for history to do something good for our American family. So, terrified at the thought, I still am, of ever speaking in public, I decided to try anyway, using rationale Lincoln used with the representatives of the border states in July of 1862. Convinced it would end the war, he urged them to free their slaves on terms they themselves could propose, or, quote, the mere frictions of war, end quote, would do it for them. And the consequences would be all the more dire because it would be done on the government's terms, leaving them with nothing. Incredibly, when they came back 2 days later, they voted down Lincoln's proposal. And a deeply frustrated and disappointed president scolded them. Don't you understand, quote, without slavery, this war could never exist, end quote. Lincoln's cold and impassioned reasoning reveals an essential truth we need to understand. And it is this: by defending the indefensible, the Confederacy hastened its demise by bringing on the war, just as today's defenders of Confederate flags and monuments have hastened the process of their removal and or destruction. And isn't that what history reveals? That tyrannies author their downfalls? After they devour the innocent, they turn on themselves rather than accept responsibility. The historic, tragic fact is Confederate generals who later became leaders of the Ku Klux Klan blamed the war not on themselves, but for their slaves wanting freedom. And not a single ex-Confederate general, including Robert E. Lee, stood up to tell them they were wrong. Even he, the greatest of all Confederates, remained silent. And if there's a more poignant example of a voice that needed to be heard, I've yet to find it. It reminds me of Mark Twain saying, quote, it is not the loudness of our enemies we will remember, but the silence of our friends. A few years ago, when historian and author Bill Hanna, a good friend of mine, and member of the Lincoln Group of Boston, gave a fascinating talk about Lincoln campaigning in New England for Zachary Taylor in the late 1840s. I kept thinking of what Lincoln said to at least one of those events before his formal speech. Lincoln told the story of two preachers, one from the North and one from the South. They were standing at a table that had an open Bible on it. The Northerner pointed to a word in it and asked the Southerner if he could see the word, and the reply was yes. The Northerner then put a coin over the word and asked, can you see it now? And the Southerner replied, no. The word was slavery. What Lincoln was implying was you can't see slavery for what it is if you looked at it through an economic equation. Now, this is not to say that slavery did not have a huge economic component to it, but it is to say that freedom is a moral issue, far more important than any economic consideration. This is one of many reasons why I love Lincoln so much. And if anyone would argue that the South would not have made more money had they freed their slaves and paid them a minimum wage, have them read the Southern author Hinton Halper's 1857 book called The Impending Crisis. When it came out, it was quickly banned in the South, but in the North, only the Bible and Uncle Tom's Cabin sold more. When Lincoln read it, he passed out copies to Congress. Since the age of 6, Civil War history has been one of 3 cornerstone loves of my life. It's the most entertaining, fascinating, glorious, sad, horrifying, humorous, romantic, sadistic, heartbreaking, yet constant prism through which I see the world. It stimulates, provokes, and insults my senses. And when it does, I feel lucky because it means I'm alive and getting closer to the truth. Within this prism, I've raised my daughter and buried her mother, my beautiful wife, and my brother, my mother, my father, my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, and cousins and friends. It seems there's no end to the burying. And history teaches that when it comes to using a shovel, none of us are immune. Against their will and without their consent, the disease of cancer enslaved my loved ones. So I understand exactly why Lincoln called slavery a cancer buried deep within the Constitution. We all do. I've witnessed up close how slavery can rob a little girl of her mother, while her mother bears the look of a slave mom watching her baby being sold away forever. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Those of us who think they've survived this witnessing are never the same, ever. Somehow though, when I feel like giving up, which is a good portion of every day these days, history sends a glimmer of light to guide me through the darkness by reminding me that I live in a free nation where light is still free to shine. Where there's freedom, love shines the brightest. That freedom is the direct result of young black and white soldiers in blue winning the American Civil War. Yet to understand the war in a full-bodied way, soldiers blue and gray can only take us so far. Wherever understanding is incomplete, by cherry-picking and taking history out of context, that is where dangerous ideas arise, while the tyrants that nurture them hide in the shadows until their flock is brainwashed to accept slavery. But when the good, bad, and ugly of history is told in its entirety, which is impossible if we're honest about it, but at least attempted with no agenda but to understand while guided by the intentions of our better angels, then history can be trusted. To understand the war the way Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass did, so our understanding can do some good in this crazy old world, we must understand, as they did, that when it comes to slavery, which every soldier was fighting over, whether they knew it or not, the voice of the slave is the only voice that matters. Today, I'm helping to raise my daughter and son-in-law's 2 girls, and the experience is joyful beyond words. When I'm sad and lonely, my little ladies surround me with so much love, I sometimes feel I'm the luckiest man alive. They make me feel like Lincoln felt when he said that everything of value in this world he learned from a woman. I'm their pa, and they trust me. And no slave master can walk into my home to sell them away from me. That, beyond a doubt, would be the end of me. When they write a school paper on the Civil War, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, or slavery, they always get an A. Somehow I've conveyed to them, as my history teacher mother conveyed to me, that Civil War history can bring comfort by bringing an understanding to any situation, which is more than anything what my book is all about. All it takes is a heart without malice and an open mind to consider that things we're taught to believe can enslave us and lead us into war, when simply remaining still to let history reveal truth is enough to stay on a path of good fellowship and citizenry. Now I know it's an odd thing saying the saddest and bloody years of our nation can bring comfort, but our mother taught my brothers and I over 50 years ago that if we wanted to know why the world is so damn screwed up, history is the key. And maybe, I like to think, it's the spirits of soldiers, blue and gray, hovering somewhere where their desire to annihilate each other no longer exists, that somehow inspires my passion. Is it their whispering I hear in dreams, or is it my wishful, melancholy imagination that they approve because they know I am honest about this war and its symbols, which does not mean I'm right. More than Civil War soldiers, though, are the ache in the eyes of slave moms and dads who had everything they were living for stolen for no reason except for what Lincoln said was the selfishness of man's nature, which is how he described where slavery comes from. That cruelest of all selfishness was protected and nurtured by men and women too addicted to their aristocratic beliefs to consider otherwise, despite slavery always being a lie. And only lies defend and make excuses for it. It's kind of like how cigarette companies used to tell kids that tobacco was good for them. For me, though, I'm among the luckiest, because when I learn I'm wrong about something because I've been lied to, it's an invitation from the universe to embrace something new and perhaps profound, even sacred. It's why Lincoln said, quote, "The dogmas of the past are no longer adequate for the present." Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, in perpetuating the cruelest selfishness, said the dogmas of slavery were adequate for the present and all future time. Never forget, Southern politicians repeatedly said they were fighting for slavery to last forever. I say it all the time. What we say and think about the American Civil War tells us very little about the war, but everything about ourselves. Inside the Civil War studying community, you can tell who someone is by what they say about the cause, politics, and religion of the war. Those outside the community deserve us to be honest, because when we try to convert using our opinion instead of historical fact, few will join. And thank God few should. Many walk away discouraged by a few misguided brethren who defend the Confederacy with falsehoods that one of America's greatest Southern Civil War historians, James Bud Robinson, said were based on things that never were. And again, defending the Confederacy is not the same as understanding it. Understanding it, unpleasant as it is, helps America understand itself. For it must be said that if we truly believe in the Declaration of Independence, it means we understand that all of us, male, female, yellow, black, white, brown, and red, be they a person of faith, an agnostic or non-believer, straight, gay, or somewhere in between, are equally capable of kindness, generosity, love, brutality, and bigotry. So we're all in this together. Yet of this, there is no doubt. Where there is love in the heart of anyone, the Confederacy was an absolute nightmare for millions of innocent men, women, and children. Defending it helps no one. It makes my heart ache because it hurts my country and therefore hurts my girls. But when we open our minds and hearts to the political realities of slavery that Lincoln and Frederick Douglass had no choice but to contend with, we are then truly an American. For we know, which is not the same as believing, because here what we believe does not count. We know that Lincoln was right when he called the support of slavery and the opposition to it the eternal struggle between right and wrong since the beginning of time. Between two antagonistic systems, one being the divine right of kings, where you work and someone else gets to keep the fruit of your labor, while the other is the rights of common man, where you work and you get to keep the fruit of your labor. That difference, that eternal struggle between right and wrong, has never been so better illustrated in our nation's history when the Confederate Army marched under the banner we're discussing today. If we tell the truth about it, people will come. If, as Thomas Jefferson said, there is a just God ruling the universe. Please envision Abraham Lincoln carrying the stars and stripes of the United States as Jefferson Davis carries the stars and bars of the Confederate States, with Frederick Douglass presiding over both. Talking about the Confederate flag is not easy, and it shouldn't be. The difficulty increases exponentially when denying the undeniable ignorance, racism, and bigotry that fed and still feeds this ultimate symbol of slavery. No image hits closer to home because the war was a war within our American family, and disputes within families are the most difficult and heartbreaking. Slavery tore black families apart. The war tore white families apart, which is not to equate the two. The suffering of black families has no equal, for it was without rational rhyme or reason. For both, though, wounds ooze discontent to this very day. Not every Union soldier was a saint, and not every Confederate a scoundrel. My God. If that weren't the case, we might as well pack it in. The Confederacy, though, was as wrong in their cause as any cause ever fought for by man. Ulysses S. Grant was right when he said that. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that's Stephen Douglas, of course, in the early fall of 1858, a member of the audience yelled out to Lincoln asking why he and Douglas only talked about slavery. Lincoln replied that it's because it is the issue of our time. In 1854, Lincoln asked, how was it possible that slave states could claim blacks were inferior when they never gave them a chance? The Southern system, he said, was designed to choke all hope of blacks ever having a chance, while we in the North proposed to give all a fair and equal chance. Not too long before the debates, he said that talking about slavery was like talking about an abscessed tooth. The first step in getting rid of it is admitting that you have it. He told the American people that slavery was evil, and again a cancer that for the health and survival of the nation could not be allowed to spread 1 inch further than it already was. In his June 16, 1858 House Divided speech, where he said this nation could not long endure half free and half slave, he explained that restricting slavery to where it was the first step in sending it to, again, quote, its ultimate extinction, end quote. In other words, ending the damn thing. And isn't that what good doctors do before they try to remove a malignancy? They try to stop it from spreading, usually with steroids and radiation. Quote, I cannot remember a time, Lincoln said, when I did not hate slavery. I hate it not just for the monstrous injustice of it, but because it allows the world to taunt us as hypocrites. In 1855, he wrote to one of his closest friends, Joshua Speed, who was from a slave-owning family in Kentucky, that, quote, "The thought of people in chains is a constant torment to me," end quote. When he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he said his whole soul was in it, and that he was never so sure he was doing the right thing, that it was the most important act of his life and what he'd be remembered for. Not only did the proclamation put rifles into the hands of 200,000 black men willing to give their lives so America could be what it claimed to be, but it shouted to the world that this war was about slavery, just as Frederick Douglass said it was from the very beginning. Lincoln knew this too. It's why he made it clear to the nation on that cool, windy day of March 4th, 1861, in his first inaugural address, 1 month before the South fight on Sumter, that, quote, "The only substantial difference between the North and South is they think slavery is right, while we think slavery is wrong." It's why Frederick Douglass said, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, "We knew this was the ending of slavery, but only if the war could be won." That has to mean something. It's also sad, but good and healthy, and right for us to know that Douglass said Lincoln was the first white man to ever treat him as an equal. Lincoln meant it when he said on that blood-soaked field of Gettysburg that the Union was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, while hundreds of thousands of innocent, let me say that again, innocent, brainwashed boys in gray would have their brains blown out charging Yankee cannons in a cause that said all men are not created equal. Lincoln said no society, north, south, east, or west, was perfect, but must always ask itself, quote, how it can do better, end quote, in striving toward a more perfect union. The bottom line for Lincoln and Douglass was equality for all, but events made their methods and timetables difficult to reconcile. Lincoln said it best, quote, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, which is my personal standard in trying to live my life. His opponent, the president of the Confederacy, Jeff Davis, called Southern society the most perfect society yet to evolve by mankind. He said slavery was the natural byproduct of any society that has its social order in its proper place. His vice president, Alexander Stephens, differed slightly, saying slavery must come first and be the foundation of any society hoping to be perfect. They, along with their slave-owning compatriots, called slavery, quote, a positive good, as good for the slave as it was good for the master. They called slavery a sacred blessing from God. They hated Lincoln for asking them if slavery was such a great thing, why then did they never try it for themselves or hope that their children would grow up to be slaves? As Secretary of War during the bloodshed over whether Kansas would be admitted to the Union as a free slave or slave state in the 1850s, Davis wrote to Senator Atchison of Missouri that if they could bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state, it would be, quote, the key to bringing slavery into the territories, end quote, which would allow the South to triumphantly introduce civilization to the world. Atchison wrote back telling Davis they would burn, murder, and hang every Yankee abolitionist that got in their way. This is my favorite. Quote, without slavery, we have no freedom. Davis and slave-owning politicians like Atchison shouted from every podium, while slave state priests, ministers, rabbis, and preachers shouted it from every pulpit. To do otherwise was against Southern law. They told their congregations that slavery was the very rock of Southern society, and again, sanctioned by God. And it must be emphasized, which is a subject for another day, that what united the North as much as anything was that the South was against American democracy. For hadn't Lincoln fairly won the election? The South repeatedly said they would abide the election results of 1860, but only if their guy, John C. Breckinridge, won. These guys are beautiful. His platform pledged that slavery could spread to the Pacific and beyond, even if only a minority of voters wanted it to. So, for the health and well-being of a nation Lincoln called the last best hope of earth, it is our obligation, when we see Confederate flags marching alongside Nazi flags in places like Charlottesville, and during the January 6th mob attack on the Capitol. It's our obligation to be honest as we possibly can be about what the Confederate flag stood for, because every time America is not honest with itself, it becomes a little weaker and loses more of its soul. History proves this, ladies and gentlemen, that democracies do not last when they're not honest about their past, whether it's recent or distant. Even when, especially when, the truth can be so very unpleasant. So why am I doing this? I'm going to have a sip of water and I'll tell you. Like Lincoln said, of wanting to go on record of where he stood on slavery during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when I think of my mortality, I so much want to go on record as helping to dispel once and for all the original big lie in America that the war was not about slavery. For that lie makes it possible for the big lies of today to be the continuation of lies aristocrats will feed future generations as opiates to keep them numb and from asking why. Not asking why is the lifeblood of the mob. It's such a no-brainer. It's so simple. If you want to know why the Confederates fought, all you have to do is ask them. They're more than happy to explain it to you. Confederate Vice President proudly boasted shortly before the Battle of Shiloh in March of 1862 that, quote, every Southern politician has put himself on record that the perpetuality and spread of slavery is the only thing the South is fighting for, end quote. So if Mark Twain had it right, that, quote, petrified opinions never freed a human soul and never will, nothing epitomizes petrified opinions like the Confederate flag. Which leads us to ask why so many in the South and far too many in the North still display with pride something that symbolizes everything that is the opposite of what this nation claims to stand for. Why do people fly it? Isn't it far more a part of Southern heritage that Southerners fought under the Stars and Stripes during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War? Yes, thousands of Southerners fought for the North. The Spanish-American War, World Wars I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, the Iraq and Afghan Wars. So why use the Confederate flag as a symbol of Southern heritage when it only flew in battle for 4 years? Is it ignorance? Or some warped dedication to an ideology that never existed? I don't have a good answer. except for this. Everything from civil wars to skirmishes in the street throughout history are caused by what people believe as opposed to what they know. People fight over what they believe, whether it's religious, political, or social. So flyers of the Confederate flags must believe something about the Confederate cause. Was the late Virginia historian and author James Bud Robinson, who again was deeply sympathetic to the South, correct when he said, knowing what we know today, you'd have to be, I was there when he said it, you'd have to be a lunatic to defend what the Confederacy was fighting for. Or are those defenders our wayward brethren who somewhere along the way fell prey to dangerous, nonsensical philosophies through no fault of their own? Get them when they're young. That's when you screw people up. Either way, the only way to help this nation is to tell them the truth, even if they don't want it. There are many, but when you ask today's defenders of the Confederate flag why they fly it, their standard big three talking points are the following. Number one, and I kind of wish I was making this one up, and I'm not so pathetic. They'll say the South was not fighting for slavery, but was fighting for the sacred right of secession. Well, while Lincoln and his family were settling into Washington in February of 1861, 12 representatives from the already seceded states were in Montgomery, Alabama, writing a new Confederate Constitution. One of them was the great Civil War Mary Chestnut's husband, James, a senator from South Carolina. James proposed that if the South truly believed in the right of secession, they should spell it out clearly in their new Constitution for the whole world to see. After they debated that, they came back the next day and voted down James's proposal 11-1, with only James voting for it. This is beyond hypocritical. It reveals that the South did not care in the least about the right to secede, but was fighting to secede to form a new nation 2/3 larger than the one they thought they already had, where the right to own a human being would last forever. Now here's the rub, which is how Lincoln described the heart of an argument. What does it mean that the South voted down the right to secede? It means the Union and Confederacy were both against secession. It's one of many contradictions that show the Confederacy was conceived on a lie, built on irony, and died from the disingenuous, twisted logic of aristocrats. And just to clarify, when I use the word aristocrat, I use it the way Mark Twain used it when he said an aristocrat is a slave owner by another name. Number two, another Confederate flag waver will tell you that the war had nothing to do with slavery because slavery was dying out and would have soon been gone. Well, history teaches otherwise. In 1850, the census recorded 347,525 American families owning slaves. In 1860, that number grew to 385,000 families, which is an enormous increase of 37,475 families, becoming the new owners of people in just 10 years. So slavery was not on its way out, but was on its way in at a rapid pace, while laws to protect it were becoming more repressive and brutal than they already were. For example, not too long before the outbreak of war, Georgia passed a law that you couldn't free your slaves even if you were dead. Sound insane? or maybe just like Georgia. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. They made it illegal for anyone to free their slaves in their wills, which had been a practice since the time of Washington and Jefferson. And as we remember that the future Confederate states had 5 million whites and 4 million blacks that the Supreme Court had already ruled in 1857 no white person had to respect, the numbers are astounding. It's no wonder we're suffering repercussions to this very day. And here's the most important thing I can say to you tonight. And for those who want to hush it all up, that in itself is a crime against humanity. Number 3, by far the most popular reason of proud flyers of the Confederate flag is that the war was not about slavery, but about states' rights and against a strong central government. If that were so, wouldn't there be a list every 5th grader could recite in her history classes of states' rights the Lincoln administration was threatening to take away from the South? If you ask a flag waver to name just a few states' rights as examples of something they say is so important to them, you'll often get a confused, blank stare, followed by a look that you've insulted them, but they can't say why. I've heard people use the fugitive slave law as an example, but wasn't that a federal law opposed to a state law? Yeah. But here's something everyone can understand. When you read the letters between them, it's crystal clear that no one argued more stringently against states' rights and in favor of a strong central government than Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. Their correspondence proves conclusively they feared the idea of states' rights would be their downfall if they didn't kill it. Moxley Sorrell, an officer on the staff of old Pete James Longstreet, recorded in his diary that shortly before the Battle of Antietam, a North Carolina regiment refused to march into Maryland, claiming it was their state right to refuse. These were men Lee could not spare, but he left them behind. When Lee and his battered army returned to Virginia, he assembled that North Carolina regiment so they could witness the executions of their officers who were kneeling, tied with stakes behind their back, and then shot. Then Lee ordered that regiment to march close to the bodies and then reassemble, where he informed them that this would be the fate of anyone using the argument of states' rights for anything. Perhaps more poignant is Lincoln explaining that when a Southerner speaks of states' rights, he means he wants to live in a state where he has the right to buy a slave, with the liberty to take that slave wherever he wants, and the freedom to do so without interference from a strong central government. In conclusion, today's Southern governors, black, white, male, and female, have it just about right when they say monuments of Confederate generals and the flag they marched under represent, quote, a shameful, racist, and bigoted past, end quote. What bothers me more than anything is not always, but when they could, monuments were put up on the very spot slave auctions happened. My God, what a thought. And yet, after all of this, to be fair, if in the end flag wavers still feel the need to defend the flag, there's 2 ways to do it. that Lincoln explained far better than I ever could. He said, all the arguments of the South make sense if you can convince yourself that a slave is not a human being. And if you can't do that, convince yourself there's nothing wrong with one person owning another. Flags and monuments that support the Confederacy are dying out. They belong in museums, classrooms, history books, historical movies, and reenactments, and places like this, so they can do some good by educating instead of confusing and brainwashing, as they do when they're put up to honor a cause that's the last cause anyone should fight for. I don't believe, I know we can do a better job telling the truth of the American Civil War. I know I've tried, still trying a little bit. All we need is, quote, charity for all, with malice toward none, end quote, on a foundation of sincerity and love. Here among friends, I've shared my passion. It will end with this. The Confederate flag truly was and is dedicated and died from the proposition that all men and women are not created equal. It's the opposite of what the Stars and Stripes, as imperfect as it is, set out to strive for, and hopefully will strive for still. Thank you for listening. Any questions or comments? Yeah, and then I'll come to you.
Every school committee should be ordered to have you speak to the middle school and high school students. You're simply eloquent.
Thank you.
Yes.
I-
Don't let it go to your head.
No, I am in the Boston school system, a very similar speech to this.
You need to be spread out.
Yeah, I'm trying to get out of this business, but I can't tell you what that means. We have to go with the mic?
Yes. Where are we going next?
In the wars that you mentioned, you made no mention of the, let's say, the Pequot Wars, Pequot War, the Narragansett War, King Philip's War, and in general, the Indian Wars.
And there's a lot more wars than that I left out too. I only have 50 minutes. But that's a great point. It's a great point.
You know, I read a lot of different books about this, so I can't remember one from the other. But it seemed from what I've read, the cause really wasn't the slavery. The cause was the expansion of slavery. Lincoln seemed to be more than willing to allow slavery in the border states, or even in the southern states, if they did secede from the Union. It seemed to be the expansion of slavery.
Lincoln, that's right, you're right.
Yeah.
Lincoln wanted democracy to end slavery, not war. He said we can end slavery by voting and having fair elections. His political platform was not to let slavery spread into the territories. And as he explained over and over again, especially during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said slavery is a cancer that if we don't get rid of it, it'll kill us. But if we go to war over it, that could kill us. He wanted democracy to solve that problem. There's the ballot, not bullets. That was his theory. And he had to be very careful at the beginning of the war, because you could not promote the war, and I didn't have time to get into this. He couldn't promote the war as a war against slavery because not enough Northerners would support that.